Hello and welcome to The Last Picture House, the podcast that takes an in-depth look at classic films. I'm your host, Marcus Lovett, and joining me in Club Berlin for Mohawk Night is Last Picture House regular Maria Suzuki. Hi, Maria.
Ciao.
This episode, Martin Scorsese's 1985 black comedy After Hours. We'll take an in-depth look at the film, not only breaking down the film's plot, themes, and characters, but also examining how Scorsese came to direct the movie, as well as what makes the film so unique. And if you enjoy the show, please remember to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or your preferred podcasting app. So let me start by saying that I'm really glad to have you on the show, Maria. While many people could describe themselves as Scorsese fans, few people I know are equally passionate about Age of Innocence or Silence as they are about Goodfellas or Taxi Driver.
Absolutely. And specifically, After Hours is very close to my heart even before I saw it. Because you must know that in Italian television, Rai 3, there's a program that I grew up watching, which is a film marathon that goes on air late at night that's called Fuori Orario, which is the Italian title of After Hours.
So Maria, in a nutshell, what is After Hours about?
After Hours tells the story of Paul Hackett, a computer word processor who desperately attempts to return home after a late-night rendezvous in New York's Soho district goes horribly wrong. But no matter how hard he tries to get back uptown, Paul's hopes are frustrated by a series of increasingly absurd encounters.
So let's start out by looking at how the film came about. Following hits with Mean Streets and Taxi Driver and Raging Bull, director Martin Scorsese's career had stalled. New York, his first big-budget studio film, had flopped at the box office. Similarly, King of Comedy had failed to find an audience, making only $2.5 million on a $19 million budget. But it was the collapse of his passion project, The Last Temptation of Christ, in 1983, that threatened to completely derail the director's career. Scorsese recalled, "I knew I was going to have to start all over." In the months before Scorsese was going into pre-production on The Last Temptation of Christ, producer Amy Robinson attended the Sundance Institute and was introduced to a script called Lies from a first-time screenwriter named Joseph Mignon.
Although his father, Dominic Dunne, was a movie producer, Griffin Dunne started out as a struggling actor. He had moved as a teenager to New York to follow in the footsteps of his hero, Al Pacino. He worked at Radio City Music Hall as a popcorn manager and scrambled for roles in off-Broadway shows. At a party, he met a couple of other frustrated actors, Amy Robinson and Mark Metcalf, and the three of them decided to get together to develop projects for themselves. Robinson brought in Ann Beattie's first novel that they could option with the money Metcalf earned for Animal House, and Triple Play Production was born. Later on, it was only Dunne and Robinson, and the company became Double Play Productions. On the other hand, Lies was the thesis at Columbia for Joseph Mignon, and his professor, Serbian director Dusan Makavejev, recommended the script to Robinson, quote, "because it is about New York, and you are from New York. You should read it."
Robinson loved the script and thought that her producing partner would be perfect for the lead role of Paul Hackett. So they bought the script and set about looking for a director. They took it to Scorsese, but while he liked the script, he was unavailable due to The Last Temptation. They then took it to a young animator who was going to get into directing live-action pictures, Tim Burton. Burton too was excited by the possibilities of the screenplay, and they began to work on the project. On Thanksgiving Day 1983, Paramount told Scorsese that they were not going ahead with Last Temptation. So now, with nothing to lose, Scorsese contacted Robinson and Dunne through their lawyer to ask what was happening with Lies. It was left for Robinson and Dunne to explain to Burton that Scorsese was now available. Burton told the pair that he didn't want to stand in the way of Scorsese, and he would respectfully withdraw from the project. It did end badly for Burton, of course, who would then direct Pee Wee Herman as his first feature.
Well, it would have been a very different movie, right?
It would have been a very different movie.
So let's talk about the cast and the staff of the film. To begin with the cast, it's a very eclectic cast, starting with Griffin Dunne as Paul Hackett, the protagonist who has starred in American Werewolf in London by John Landis 1981. And we discussed this film in our episode on Monsters at Metaphor, episode 11. So if you're curious about what we have to say about this, please check it out. And as the love interest of Paul Hackett, there's Rosanna Arquette as Marcy. She starred in another film produced in 1983 by Double Play, which is called Baby It's You by John Sayles.
Have you seen it?
No. I've seen only the trailer. It's kind of a high school love drama. I mean, interesting, but I'm not in a hurry to watch it. But Rosanna Arquette was really the it girl of the 80s, if you think about it, with a song dedicated to her by Toto, a film with Madonna, Desperately Seeking Susan, which I've seen many times. I love that. Later on, she was cast again by Scorsese as the young protege of a tormented artist played by Nick Nolte in the short Life Lessons. By far the most successful segment of the New York Stories.
It's arguably the only successful.
I don't know. I quite like Oedipus Rex. And as Kiki Bridges, the mysterious artist Linda Fiorentino, before her apotheosis as the queen of neo-noir in films like John Dahl's The Last Seduction, 1994. And we have Terry Garr as Julie, the cocktail waitress stuck in the 60s. Verna Bloom as June, a mature woman that Paul meets in the club. Thomas Chong, Cheech Marin, aka the comic duo Cheech and Chong, as a pair of burglars, Neil and Pepe. John Hurt as Tom, dive bar owner, and Catherine O'Hara, that we now love and know as Moira Rose, the quirky matron in the TV series Schitt's Creek, as Gail, the owner of a Mr. Softy ice cream truck. Later on, Hurd and O'Hara will be cast as a couple and parents of the protagonist in Home Alone.
Evil parents.
Maybe they met in this movie. Yeah. Who knows? As characters. As for the technical staff, apart from his longtime collaborator, editor Thelma Schoonmaker, After Hours used the same crew from Baby It's You, the movie produced by Double Play Production that we mentioned earlier. Production designer Jeffrey Townsend, or even costume designing staff. And notably, among these staff, there were cinematographer Michael Ballhaus. And Marcus, you will talk about him extensively later. Anyway, this marked the first collaboration between Ballhaus and Scorsese. In Ballhaus' words, this was a team of young people eager to work hard and fast. 25 to 30 people, so quite a small
So it's a really
staff.
small crew, yeah.
Yeah, small crew.
So the way we're going to do this, dear listeners, is that we've broken the script down into 3 sections so that we can explain the film's plot and then talk about scenes in detail.
It goes without saying that this episode is going to be spoiler heavy. So if you haven't seen the film, you should hit pause and watch it now.
And come back. Okay, so let's look at the first section of the film. The film begins with a wild dolly shot across the floor of a corporate office to where Paul Hackett, Griffin Dunne, is training a staff member in how to use the PC. This is, of course, the mid-80s. As the new staffer explains that he doesn't intend to be in the job for long, Paul's mind begins to wander. The scene cuts to Paul leaving the building through a pair of large metal doors. In his sparsely furnished apartment, Paul lies on the sofa and flips board between channels on a remote control. Alone, Paul visits a nearby restaurant with a copy of Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer for company. He is approached by a young blonde woman, Rosanna Arquette, who says how much she loves Miller's novel. She goes on to explain that she's staying with a friend in Soho, that the friend is a sculptress, and lately her friend has been making these plaster of Paris bagels and cream cheese, which she's been trying to sell as paperweights. Paul feigns interest in buying some, and leaving, the girl gives Paul her friend Kiki's number.
Something interesting to note here, the director's trademark, Marty's own mom and dad, are sitting in the diner at the meet cute.
So Paul returns home and immediately calls Kiki. A disinterested voice answers the phone. When Paul explains that he met a girl who told him about the plaster of Paris bagels and cream cheese, Kiki immediately calls out Marcy, and the girl from the previous scene comes to the phone. She explains that she had just had a terrible argument with a friend and invites Paul to Kiki's that evening. She gives Paul the address, and the scene ends with Paul agreeing to go downtown. A nearby clock reads 11:32 p.m. Downstairs, Paul hails a yellow cab. As he jumps in the back seat, a manic flamenco song starts to play. The cab speeds off, and Paul is flung from one side of the cab to the other. At one point, Paul manages to place a $20 bill in the change cradle on the back of the driver's seat. To his horror, the bill flies out the window. Eventually, the cab arrives in front of Kiki's apartment, at which point Paul explains to the driver what has happened. "I'm sorry, I have no money." The driver glares at him for a moment before speeding away. Paul makes his way to the front of the apartment building. The name on the door, Franklin, is crossed out and replaced with Kiki Bridges. Paul pushes the buzzer for Kiki's loft. A face appears at a window high above him. "Are you Paul?" When Paul replies in the affirmative, Kiki, that's Linda Fiorentino, tosses a giant set of keys down to him, which miss Paul by inches. Paul enters Kiki's apartment, which is dominated by a papier-mâché sculpture resembling Edvard Munch's The Scream. Paul comments that it looks like that painting, The Shriek. Kiki is working on the sculpture. When Paul asks for Marcy, Kiki tells him that she had to go to an all-night drugstore. Paul asks innocently, "Is she all right?" Kiki replies, "It's under control." Kiki asks Paul if he would help her with her work. Paul reluctantly sets about adding paper to the sculpture when the telephone rings. He overhears Kiki talking to Marcy. "Of course he's here. You invited him." "Well, that's your problem." "Well, I'm not going to tell him." Paul clumsily spills papier-mâché on his shirt. Kiki returns and offers to clean it. When Paul protests, she argues that it will only take 20 minutes and that he wants to look good for his big date. Paul finally agrees. When Kiki returns, she offers him a black shirt to wear while he waits. She rubs her shoulders, complaining that they're sore after a day spent dipping. Paul offers to give her a massage, and Kiki very quickly agrees. Paul tells Kiki that she has a good body, to which she replies, "Yes, not a lot of scars." Kiki continues, "Some women are covered head to toe in scars." Paul then starts telling a story of how, as a child, there was no room in the hospital when he had his tonsils removed, so the nurse blindfolded him and took him up to the burns ward. At the end of the story, just as he's about to steal a peek by removing the blindfold, Paul realizes that Kiki has fallen asleep. He lets go of her and she flops onto the sofa.
Well, this script is full of very quirky lines.
At that moment, Marcy enters the apartment. She ignores Kiki and suggests Paul come with her away from all this mess and into her bedroom. After telling Paul that she's really happy he came over, that she feels like she could really let loose, Marcy tells him to wait while she takes a quick shower. Kiki, topless, appears at the door and asks if Marcy is home. Paul says yes, and Kiki wanders off yawning. Still alone in Marcy's room, Paul looks over at the bag Marcy brought home from the drugstore. He finds a tube of ointment inside. The label reads, "For the treatment of second-degree burns." Marcy reappears, and Paul quickly returns the ointment to the bag. Seeing Marcy shivering, Paul offers to close the window. She tells him that she can do it, and struggling to close it, she remarks that whoever used to live in the room must have been a bodybuilder. Marcy asks Paul's patience just for one more minute, and she again leaves the room. He can hear Marcy and Kiki giggling. Paul gazes out the window and sees two people having sex in a nearby apartment. When Marcy comes back, she asks what he said. Paul protests he didn't say anything. Marcy sits down next to Paul, and he sniffs the air and asks what he can smell. She tells him it's just skin moisturizer. Paul leans forward to kiss her, and she pulls away. Paul is clearly starting to feel uneasy. She asks if they can just talk. It's around this time that he glances at her thigh, which appears to be covered in scars. Marcy then tells Paul that she was once raped in this very room. Paul looks horrified and asks if they got the guy. She tells him that he was an ex-boyfriend, that it took place in that very room, and, truth be told, she slept through most of it. Paul looks again out the window, and the couple across the way pull their curtain closed. For a moment, Marcy seems to be grinning at Paul. The phone rings. Neither Paul or Marcy pick it up. Finally, Marcy stands up and asks Paul if he wants to go and get coffee. Paul reminds Marcy that it's late, but she points out that it's not yet 2 a.m. Leaving the apartment, Paul glances down at Kiki's statue and sees that a $20 bill is in amongst the papier-mâché newspaper. So here we cut to a diner, where Paul orders 2 coffees, and he asks Marcy who Franklin, the name on the apartment, is. Marcy explains that Franklin is her ex-husband, that he owns the apartment, and he's now in Turkey. Paul presses Marcy for more about Franklin. She tells him that she was young and that they were only married for 3 days. She goes on to tell Paul that her ex was a movie freak, and he was obsessed with one movie in particular.
The Wizard of Oz.
The Wizard of Oz. In one of the film's most memorable moments, she relates to Paul how Franklin was so obsessed with the film that during sex, he would finish by shouting, "Surrender, Dorothy." Paul looks stunned, and Marcy rounds off the moment by saying that she still loves him and writes to him every other day. Paul asks for the check, and Peter the waiter tells them that the coffee is on the house.
Well, this is one of my favorite scenes for two different reasons. One is that Peter, the waiter played by Dick Miller, when he catches Marcy's flying kiss, he is so reminiscent of so many waiters and bar owners of my town, Rome. There's so many people like that. And second of all, I think that this scene sets the whole tone of the entire movie, because Peter's line is, "Different rules apply when it gets this late." You know what I mean. It's like after hours.
It's interesting that you say that, because for me, it's not so much this scene that sets the tone for the film, but really the previous scene, where the information that Paul is getting is in some way being messed up, so that he's not really getting the full story. And we see him slowly becoming more concerned, more paranoid about the reality of what's going on. So as much as I'd like to quiz you about the flirty waiters of Rome, let's continue. Back on the stairs of Marcy and Kiki's apartment, Paul gently tries to kiss Marcy. She begins to cry. She leads him inside and back to her bedroom. She suggests lighting a candle and leaves the room. Again, there is whispering outside the room. Paul notices a book by the door and leafs through it. The book is illustrated with horrific images of burn victims. Marcy re-enters and Paul quickly returns the book. Marcy now proffers a joint. Paul takes a drag and angrily tells Marcy it isn't grass. He's becoming more and more annoyed. The scene ends with him demanding that she show him the plaster of Paris bagel and cream cheese paperweights. That was the only reason he'd come after all. Marcy cries and Paul hurries out of the apartment. Outside, it's pouring with rain.
Okay, so let's begin talking about Paul Hackett. Who is this guy? So he's a word processor, which I think is like he does data entry, right? So we immediately know that he has a dull job and a dull life. You know, that scene when he's instructing some new guy, it's like he almost seems...
Belky.
He almost feels like satisfied doing that, happy with that the guy is learning. And then soon after that, the young guy says, "This is temporary for me." Yeah. And this is a full-time job for him, for Paul. So you see a very hurt look in his eyes.
Yeah, it's interesting because Paul doesn't seem to be questioning this very dull job that he has. This is everything that he was looking for in life, or this is his calling. It reminds me a little bit of Emmett from the Lego movie. Mm-hmm. You know, this guy who wakes up in the morning and his job is to work on a building site and he doesn't question anything that's going on around him. He's living a kind of separate reality.
But at the same time, I think it's interesting because it's, in a way, he's an aspirational guy because, you know, he goes to a diner, bringing a Henry Miller book, so a book about macho guy that lives in Paris, a kind of semi-autobiographical book. And he clearly wants something. He aspires to something that he doesn't have.
Yeah, but he's also a recognizable yuppie. He has a thin tie and the suit. He's very much the 80s man.
Very unglamorous because, you know, it's not the American Psycho level of yuppie, really glamorous lifestyle.
He's not living the lifestyle of Christian Bale in that film.
Yeah. But, you know, he tries to keep up with the artists, trying to talk about moon.
Well, yeah, he has, I think, a David Hockney painting on his wall, or a reproduction of a painting on his wall.
Yeah.
And yeah, he's reading Henry Miller. So yes, there is that kind of aspect of his character, I think.
He's clearly not a night owl because when Marcy suggests a meeting and she says, maybe it's too late, he looks at the...
He does look at the clock. Yeah,
the clock.
He looks like a guy who, there are rules. Yeah. Like, he has his own set of rules by which he lives his life, and he's not prepared to throw caution to the wind and cross town until this particular evening.
Yeah, so he's probably a very decent guy, even though not particularly adventurous or passionate, right? And also, I think he is kind of stingy because I don't know, it's 85, so I don't know how much the value of a $20 bill is, but you know, you're going to meet a chick, so you're going to probably spend something, go drinking somewhere or something. And at one point...
You're saying his whole dating approach is to take $20 and that's it.
Yeah, I mean...
Very limited.
And after that, she suggests to go to a diner, but he doesn't have any money. So what is he thinking, that she's going to pay? As a prospect date, it's not very...
That's right, and it's pre-ATMs and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to plan a little bit.
Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it's interesting that he doesn't have a credit card because, of course, credit cards were around then. As you said, it does seem very strange that he's only willing to spend $20 on this adventure downtown. And what do we make of Marcy's character?
I think Marcy remains a mystery up until the end, I think. She's very volatile. Sometimes she's very enthusiastic, almost very flirty, but she clearly has some kind of trauma.
Well, this is something I want to talk about more later on, but to me, all of the people that Paul encounters during the evening, he never really gets to know any of them. I mean, everybody's a cipher to some degree. And the people who tell him things or try to explain their inner thoughts, their inner lives, either he's not listening or what they're saying is not what he was talking about. So, he's constantly being hit with information about somebody's angst or whatever it is, the various people, mostly women that he meets over the course of the evening. And he's never really getting to know or listening to anybody.
Yeah, I think there is a constant disconnect in this movie.
And it's one of the things that makes the film, I think, so interesting is that point of view, that we're seeing everything exclusively from Paul's point of view. So when we meet Marcy, of course you could argue that she's more or less a plot device because she's there to be the MacGuffin to get him to travel down to Soho. But at the same time, she seems rich with information about her past, but nothing really satisfies Paul's curiosity. Everything she tells him just asks more questions. So it's a bit like that, J.J. Abrams' black box thing, that you just keep creating more and more questions, and that's what the character's doing.
I think in that sense it's really typical of those nighttime rendezvous, nighttime meeting between strangers when you
tell me more, Maria.
when you kind of have a different set of expectation to the person and you kind of pursue it, and most of the times it doesn't really fit what the person actually is.
Okay, there's a lot more to talk about there, but we might do that off mic. What about the setting? So at this point, we've moved from uptown, or sort of like the 90s somewhere, and then we've now landed in Soho. One of the things I think that's really important about this film is that Soho is a character. At night, there's very few, if any, people around, and that everyone who we do encounter in the streets of Soho becomes a character. Now, some of that's later on, but already, once he gets out of the cab in these deserted streets, we're starting to feel that Paul is on his own, and that the city is sort of looking down at him.
And he's very, very much out of his element.
You're out of your element.
And really worth noting is the fast pacing of this movie, right?
Exactly. So the film begins with this hard dolly up to Paul in this corporate office. And from that moment, I think Scorsese and Ballhaus are really setting the tone for the film. Ballhaus, for anyone who's not familiar with Michael Ballhaus, he worked for many years during the 1970s with German director Rainer Werner Fassbinder. And he was used to working very fast on very little money. He was able to quickly put together all of these very elaborate tracking shots that we see in the film. There is track in just about everything. And if you're able to get the DVD and watch the extras, in the commentary, Ballhaus talks about the crew that he had and the ability to be able to kind of really quickly set up each night. I think they were doing something like 16 setups rather, every evening throughout this, 40-day shoot?
Yeah, and Scorsese says that he went to his trailer just only once, and he never had the time again to go back.
Yeah, because things were moving so quickly. The camera is always moving, and it's just really amplifying this sense of desperation throughout the film. And as we've already mentioned, the film's very much from Paul's point of view. So as things start to get worse for Paul, and they will get much worse for Paul, the camera seems to be a reflection of Paul and his anxiety, his creeping paranoia.
And sometimes also the camera seems to be also independent and its own character. It's very lively. I think Ballhaus starts really making a very interesting collaboration that we will see in Goodfellas about camera work.
Yeah, and it's something that we also see in the next film, which is Color of Money. It's not the greatest script, but the camera just is constantly moving around the pool tables and following the balls as they move across the felt. It's extraordinary camera work in that film. And yeah, it does seem that the tone is being set with the relationship and the collaboration between Scorsese and Ballhouse in After Hours.
Especially, I would like to talk about the scene where Kiki throws the keys to Paul.
Yeah, the first time that she throws the keys down to Paul. And one of the things that Ballhouse talks about is that they had built a contraption so that they could literally drop a camera down at Griffin Dunne, being the point of view of the keys as they fell towards Griffin Dunne's face. This turned out to be incredibly dangerous, and it seems that only Griffin Dunne didn't think it was dangerous, but everyone else on set thought it was terrifying. So they only did it, I think, once or twice before they decided, no, maybe we can shoot this in a slightly different way.
No, they did it once, but Griffin Dunne would let's do it again. And Martin Scorsese said that he realizes how courageous actors are.
I guess what's notable about this particular moment, Scorsese described it as a, pardon the pun, key moment in the film.
Nice.
But as the keys fall towards Griffin Dunne's face, we know that he's being placed in mortal danger. And this is really setting the tone for what's coming next.
Also, I think that this movie is really made of, if you allow me the expression, the very same fabric of a long city night. Because it shows that it was shot mostly at nighttime. Mm-hmm. And Dunne
I think
itself,
the whole film was shot at night.
Yes.
Even the interiors were shot at night.
And also Dunne, on a specific request of Scorsese, was sleep and sex deprived. So I think it's really realistic how the pacing is different. You know that sometimes like between 12 or 2, a lot of things happen. And then there's this kind of dead time between 3 or 4. So this movie really captures the spirit of the night.
So just to explain that, Scorsese asked Dunne not to have sex so that he would visibly be frustrated throughout the course of the film. So it's kind of interesting how this film has this kind of creeping paranoia. And it reminded me a lot of Thomas Pynchon's writing. And now, for those of you who are familiar with Paul Thomas Anderson's Inherent Vice, that's a film which is an adaptation of Thomas Pynchon's writing. And in that particular case, I felt that the paranoia wasn't there enough. It wasn't manifest enough. All of Pynchon's writing is about the manifestation of the neuroses of the lead character. And this is very much what's going on in After Hours. And I think Scorsese and Schoonmaker and all the people involved, they really show how the world is slowly turning against Paul, but he doesn't know why. And later we'll hear how he's questioning what he's done to deserve this kind of horrible night, yet there is no reason for it. It's his own neuroses and it's his own guilt, and there is no reason for the world turning against him. So let's continue. Paul runs through the rain and down into a subway station. At the ticket office, he throws down a few coins he's had for a subway token. Nonplussed, the subway attendant tells him that the fare went up at midnight and the fare is now $1.50. In some of the funniest dialogue in the film, Paul desperately begs the man's understanding. "Come on, give me a break," says Paul, to which the attendant replies, "I could lose my job." "Who would know?" asks Paul, exasperated. The attendant deadpans. "I could go to a party. I could talk." Hearing an approaching train, Paul jumps the gates, at which point a police officer appears and Paul quickly backtracks and climbs the stairs back into the rain.
I think this part is really, really important. First of all, the subway scene is my second favorite scene in the movie. A great casting. Murray Moonstone, who made 5 films with Scorsese. For example, he was the timekeeper of Iris in Taxi Driver. Here we can really see, especially when the cop comes in, that Paul is really a fish out of water here. And all of his sense of entitlement that you can see still in his in his way he's dealing with the ticket guy really drops in front of the authority.
Such a good way to put it, the sense of entitlement that nothing is working and he's not capable of responding. Paul makes his way into a local bar and he's soaked to the bone. Inside, there's only one couple, slow dancing. A waitress, Julie, played by Terry Garr, with a beehive hairdo, asks Paul what she can get him. He tells her that he only has 97 cents, and if it's okay, he'd like to sit for a while and not order anything. She leaves him and walks over toward the bar. At this point, Paul tries to light a cigarette, but his matches are too wet. He gets up to take matches from the cigarette machine. When he returns, there's a check face down on his table. He turns it over, revealing the words, "I hate this job, help me." He looks over at Julie, and she nods approvingly. Paul goes into the men's room, and while he stands to relieve himself, he notices on the wall a drawing of a naked man whose penis is erect and in the jaws of a shark. It's one of the film's more indelible images.
And it's also already in the script, right?
Yeah, it's in the fourth draft, which we've linked to in the show notes. When Paul returns to the bar, he tells Julie he came in to escape the rain. The barman, Tom, John Hurd, asks why he doesn't just take the train, and Paul explains that he's broke. Tom then offers to lend him the money for a train token. Paul is thanking Tom profusely when a man appears outside the window holding up 4 fingers. Tom shouts, "Oh, Christ, not another one." He explains to Paul that the man outside is a neighbor and that he's already been in many times that night to tell him about 3 separate robberies in the neighborhood. Tom, the bartender, then tells Paul that he's unsure whether he turned on his burglar alarm. So then Tom goes over to the cash register. He's going to get money for Paul. No matter what Tom does, it refuses to open. Paul raises an arm to calm the situation, and Tom tells him, "I just don't like not being able to open the cash register. What if we get a rush now?" Paul asks him if there's a key or something, and Tom tells him that it's back in his apartment. Hitting on a solution, the bartender suggests to Paul that he go there and get the key. It's close by. Paul agrees enthusiastically, and just as Tom is handing over the keys on an unforgettable skull and crossbones keychain, he has second thoughts. Wait a second, what am I doing? Clearly, Tom is starting to worry about the idea of giving his keys to Paul. Paul manages to seal the deal by taking out his own keys and passing them to the bartender. Tom explains that the cash register keys are above the light switch and that the alarm is under the light switch. Paul, armed with a nearby address, leaves the bar, promising to be back soon. Paul climbs the stairs to Tom's apartment. He opens the door and quickly finds the alarm above the light switch. Paul goes to the bathroom to wash his face. He can't find anything to dry it, so he uses some nearby tissues, which he then casually throws into the toilet and flushes. To Paul's horror, the toilet immediately gets clogged and begins to overflow onto the floor of the bathroom.
Best clogged toilet since the one Peter Sellers had to deal with in Blake Edwards' The Party.
Panicked, Paul leaves the apartment. He's going down the stairs when he passes 2 men talking on the stairwell. They accuse Paul of being the friendly neighborhood burglar. Paul explains that he's a friend of Tom's. Which Tom? They ask. This building has at least 3 Toms. Paul tells them that he doesn't know the guy's last name, but that Tom lives in the apartment on the top floor. The men eventually let Paul leave, explaining that there have been at least 8 break-ins in the neighborhood just this week. Exiting the building, Paul sees 2 figures carrying a television set and the monk-like papier-mâché sculpture out of Kiki's apartment building. He yells stop, and the men drop both items, jump in a van, and drive away. Paul ignores the now broken TV and picks up the sculpture, placing it awkwardly on his shoulders.
I think here you can see one trait of Paul. I mean, he doesn't need to do that. Why is he worried about the statue and going to bring it back to Kiki?
I think it's a very good question.
His problem would have been solved much earlier.
Yeah, particularly because there's a $20 note on the statue, but never mind. He presses the buzzer to Kiki's apartment. Kiki's face appears at the now familiar window, but this time she appears differently. She's bound and gagged. Kiki has her keys in her mouth and drops them down to Paul. He enters the building, climbs the stairs, and finds Kiki on the floor. He removes her gag. "How did they get in?" Paul asks. Kiki asks what he's talking about. "The men leaving just now with your sculpture." Kiki breaks into a grin and tells Paul that Neil and Pepe are friends and that she just sold her TV. She goes on to ask what Paul is doing with the sculpture. At that moment, a man dressed in S&M gear walks into the room. His name is Horst. This is Will Patton. Horst asks, "This the guy?" And Kiki says yes. Horst continues, "That was very rude of you before, Paul. You ought to be ashamed of yourself." Paul replies, "I am." Lack of discipline? Kiki suggests to Paul that it's not too late to finish what he started with Marcy. Accepting Kiki's advice, Paul makes his way into Marcy's bedroom. He finds her lying in bed, looking straight at him. Paul begins a lengthy apology, explaining that he'd been scared off by all the talk of the ex-husband and the boyfriend. When Marcy doesn't respond, Paul goes over to her and discovers that she's dead. An empty bottle of sleeping pills is next to her. Paul runs, terrified, out of the bedroom, shouting for Kiki, but she and Horst have left. A note says that they've gone to Club Berlin and that Marcy and Paul are welcome to join them. Paul calls the police, who tell him to stay there. After hanging up, Paul glances at Marcy's thigh and realizes that she has no scars after all. Instead, she has a tattoo of a skull and crossbones. Suddenly, Paul remembers that he still has Tom's keyring. The scene cuts to Paul moving about the apartment, sticking up hand-drawn signs, maybe serviettes, each with an arrow and the words "dead person" written on them. Paul then leaves the apartment building in the direction of Tom's bar. As he's running through the incessant rain, he hears a woman trying to get his attention. It's Julie, standing under an umbrella. She announces that she did it, she finally quit her job, and she wants him to come and celebrate. Paul is openly dismissive. He tells her that he's got to drop off Tom's keys so he can go home. On further questioning, it's revealed that Julie hasn't actually left her job and that she's simply on a break. When they reach the bar, there's a note on the door saying, "Back in half an hour." Paul's desperate. Julie asks if he wants to come and have a TV dinner at her place across the street. At that moment, Neil and Pepe drive past the bar. Paul shouts after their van, but they drive away. The scene then moves to Julie's apartment, which is done up in 60s kitsch. Julie offers Paul food, but he rejects it with a shake of the head. Putting on a record, Julie asks Paul if he likes the Monkees. She asks Paul if he's had a rough night. Paul attempts to answer, but breaks down. Nonplussed, Julie changes the record. Joni Mitchell. Julie then asks Paul to unburden himself of whatever is wrong. As he talks, she begins to sketch him. Paul looks out the window, agitated. The bar is still closed. His gaze moves to the other side of Julie's room, where he sees a semicircle of mousetraps. He swears under his breath. Julie goes on to tell Paul that she works a second job at the Xerox shop downstairs. She explains that she has the keys if he wants to see it, and that one of the perks is that she can make copies whenever she wants. Paul ignores her. She becomes angry and complains that she overhears customers calling her stupid all the time. Paul tries to smooth things over with her, saying that she's not stupid and that he's sorry for being rude. Finally, she asks Paul if he likes her hairdo. Obviously lying, Paul responds in the affirmative. Paul hears a noise outside and, realizing that the bar is reopened, exclaims that he can finally go home. Julie protests and tells him that he can stay. "You're not going to walk out on Julie, not after I let you touch my beehive hairdo." Feeling guilty, Paul says he'll come right back in 2 minutes after he drops off Tom's keys. Paul returns to the bar, where Tom explains that when Paul was taking so long, Tom thought Paul might be the burglar after all, and he went to the apartment to check up on him. Relieved to have his keys back, Tom offers Paul a drink. Paul reveals that Julie is waiting for him back at her apartment. Tom recommends he take off. "What you gonna do, kill herself?" At that moment, the phone rings. Tom speaks on the phone, then hangs up, suddenly appearing devastated. Paul asks, "What's the matter?" Tom says, "My girlfriend killed herself just a little while ago. Sleeping pills." Tom goes on to explain that he and his girlfriend had a fight that afternoon. Tom punches the bar and cries, "Marcy, Marcy, Marcy." Paul flees the bar. I think anyone would flee the bar at this point. Paul flees the bar and goes back across the street to Julie's apartment, where he's relieved to find her waiting. Julie asks if Paul missed her, and Paul replies that he missed her like nobody in his whole life. Julie then kisses Paul and tells him she wants him to have a present. She goes to a nearby drawer and produces a plaster of Paris bagel and cream cheese paperweight. Just as Paul is saying, "How nice," one of the mousetraps beside Julie's bed snaps shut. Paul tells her that he has to go, but promises to see her again. Julie suddenly becomes angry, and to placate her, Paul offers to exchange phone numbers. Shutting the front door behind him, Paul breathes a sigh of relief. The door opens, and Julie says, "You forgot this," and holds up the plaster bagel, which Paul then knocks out of her hand. Mad, she slams the door in his face.
I think here really there's a shift in Paul's mission, in Paul's objective, which is to just go back home.
Yeah, he's trying to go home despite the suicide.
Yeah, nothing else matters.
Yeah,
For
nothing
him,
matters. He just wants to get home. He'll deal with it tomorrow.
maybe. Yeah. And I think that the plaster cream cheese bagel paperweight is really the thing that makes him snap out of the situation. Because in the first place, why does he go back to Julie's apartment?
Yeah. One of the things that's so extraordinary about this is that it keeps setting up roadblocks and obstacles for Paul. And in trying to resolve one obstacle, one roadblock, what's happening is that he's getting deeper and deeper into this maze. You know, he's like one of the rats.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's
Yeah.
just constantly being drawn further and further into this labyrinth.
And the single action is something that's plausible because obviously you see people that are thinking that you did something wrong. The easiest way, maybe instead of explaining, is to just run away. Maybe we will do the same thing. So but what I find really interesting here is that for the inspiration, Martin Scorsese talks about 1940s films like Farce that were by a director called Alan Dwan. And there's these movies that you can find on YouTube. One of these is Brewster's Million, which is, I think it was remade in the 80s with Richard Pryor. But it's a 1945 film where the guy, in order to inherit $7 million, he has to be able to show that he can spend $1 million in a month. So he does everything to just squander money, but he must not tell anyone.
Well, it also reminds me a little bit of the 39 Steps, the Hitchcock film.
Yeah.
Remember that scene where he goes to the fortune teller and there's no real reason that he has to go through all of these different episodes. It's the journey of somebody who is trying to resolve the thing that happened in the previous scene every time.
But it's A, so you go to B, and it's doomed. You're going to be doomed, but you go there anyway.
I mean, the thing, I guess what we're saying here is that the Paul is trapped and he's becoming even more trapped. Every action is leading to him going deeper.
Yeah, so talking about Alan Dwan's film is the same thing that happens. I strongly advise you, if you have the time, to watch one of these films, because what happens is the protagonist is constantly gaslit by all the people that are around him, which is exactly what happens to Paul. So he tries to explain, he tries to say things, but people don't understand him or take it the wrong way. So the process is really the same. And it's really interesting that you mentioned Hitchcock, because Martin Scorsese says that this film is an homage to Hitchcock, but a parody.
And we also have to mention the way that Paul responds to Julie here. He's gone back to Julie worrying that something might have happened to her because of his guilt over what's happened to Marcy. So this response he has, I've never missed anyone so much in my entire life.
It's purely emotional, right?
Yeah, it's his guilt, but he didn't do anything.
That's the thing. It's like, it's really an interesting character that Martin Scorsese says this is guilt-ridden character, and this is something that he adores, quote.
Well, he didn't write the screenplay, but it is perfect Scorsese material, isn't it?
But it's a perfect Catholic guilt-ridden person. You see all different doomed men in Hitchcock film, like Henry Fonda in The Wrong Man, which is a movie that Scorsese cites as the inspiration. But what's really different in Paul's case is that Paul really hasn't done anything from any point of view, but he feels so guilty all the time.
So we left with Paul having the door slammed in his face by Julie, and he walks out of the apartment and finds once again that the bar is closed. Across the street, he looks on as Neil and Pepe load their van and drive off. Paul then makes his way to Tom's apartment, where he's accused a second time of being a burglar by Tom's neighbors. This time, Paul runs away, corroborating their suspicions. The neighbors comb the area as Tom hides beneath the stairs. Paul returns to the diner from earlier in the film and asks to use the bathroom. The friendly waiter is long gone. Now a man behind the counter tells him that the toilets are for customers only and that he'll have to order something. Paul promises to order something and makes his way to the back of the restaurant. In the bathroom, Paul looks at his anguished reflection in the mirror. When he attempts to leave the diner without ordering, the owner points to a booth and tells him to make himself comfortable. Paul sits down and remembers Kiki's invitation to Club Berlin. He walks by the owner saying that he has to put a quarter in the meter and he'll be back in a moment. He'll have a burger, medium rare, and a coffee.
I think that here really his a little transformation in a crook is kind of complete because for the first time he does something.
Well, he's actually taking action.
Yeah, he's taking action because he's ordering something that he thinks he will never get to eat.
So yes, he has crossed the line. Arriving at Club Berlin, Paul walks up to a bouncer in a Checkpoint Charlie t-shirt and asks if he can enter. "I can't let you in at the moment," is the reply. "Will it be possible to be admitted at a more convenient time for the club?" asks Paul. "It is possible," says the bouncer, "but not at the moment." Paul offers the bouncer money, which he takes, but returns a quarter to Paul. "You still have to wait a few minutes," he says. At this moment, a young punk comes to the door and the bouncer immediately waves him through. Paul asks, why doesn't he have to wait a few minutes? To which the bouncer replies, "Tonight's Mohawk night. If you had a mohawk, you could go in." Paul protests, and the bouncer says ominously, "You sure you want to go in?" Here, the action suddenly cuts to the inside of the club. Bad Brains is playing loud on the sound system. The room is full of young men, all of whom have mohawks. Paul pushes through the crowd, shouting Kiki's name, but club-goers have other ideas, and Paul is forced into a chair, and a man begins to shave his head. After some struggle, Paul manages to break free and run back to Kiki's loft. The door's still open, so he goes inside and takes the $20 bill from the back of Kiki's monk-like papier-mâché sculpture, the Shriek.
Oh, Club Berlin. First of all, the dialogue between the bouncer and Paul is apparently reminiscent of Kafka, right?
Yeah, I believe it's from The Trial. I did read the book, but I can't remember that particular dialogue.
And there's a great cameo of Martin Scorsese in the club. He's upstairs chasing Paul with a spotlight, wearing a military jacket.
So as far as Scorsese cameos go, I think this is definitely up there with Taxi Driver, where he's one of the customers.
We were talking about this sense of paranoia that's in all the movies, and it's most certainly enhanced by the music.
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting about the soundtrack for this film is it's so eclectic. So it begins, I think, with Mozart, there's Bach, and here in the club, it's Bad Brains, right? Mm-hmm. It's almost like Scorsese's trying to see how far he can go with the soundtrack. It's one of the more extreme soundtracks. I mean, there's also that flamenco track in the cab at the beginning.
And also, it's the second movie after Taxi Driver where there's dedicated score, this time by Howard Shore.
Howard Shore. Well, let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
So really emphasizes the sense of being trapped, you know, the game of the film.
First of all, it has this ticking of a clock embedded. Mm-hmm. So you always have this sense of time chasing you.
While the score may sound a little bit dated today, I mean, as you said, it does emphasize this sort of ticking clock, the game, the fact that Paul is trapped. It reminds me a little bit of other soundtracks from that period, you know, like Frantic, for example.
In my case, it reminds me really of a lot of the Goblins soundtrack for Dario Argento's movie.
Oh,
like
yeah,
Suspiria
absolutely,
or Deep Red.
And on the subject of being trapped, I mean, there's also the image of the mousetraps in Julie's apartment.
How creepy is that? A bed surrounded by mousetraps. I know that mouse.
I mean, she has, if I remember correctly, she has a semicircle of mousetraps around her bed.
Yeah, it's a semicircle of.
What does it mean, Maria?
I think the easy answer is the theme that is predominant in all this movie, which is the emasculation, from the scribble in the bar with the giant penis in the shark's mouth. Yeah. You know, it's really interesting because film critic Robin Wood described this film as a male nightmare. And I'm quoting, "The nightmare of a world in which the father, with capital F, no longer presides, in which nothing is any longer in its correct place. Hence the film's emphasis on independent women and gay men."
But isn't that really just going back to what you said earlier, which is white privilege, that this character expects things to work for him because they always did?
Yeah, I think that this movie, in a way, belongs to a very short-lived and very narrow subgenre, which is the yuppie in peril cycle.
Hang on, this is a subgenre? Tell me more.
Yeah, no, it includes John Landis' Into the Night and Jonathan Demme's Something Wild. So there's the yuppie character who's only...
Something Wild is a very good example. Yeah. Now I see your point.
Yeah, and the only thing that makes the white, straight male superior was the money. And in Paul's case, he gets stripped of that. So he really, all the sense of entitlement that he constantly has to be faced with the reality of him counting as nothing without his money and knowing nobody and everything that he is doing, his work, his reputation doesn't count anything. Film is so different from, like, for example, something wild, or because there's no real arc of the protagonist. There's no real growth.
That's a great question. What does Paul learn? Now, we haven't got to the end of the film yet, but what is it that Paul has learned so far?
I think that he gets a little savvy because he probably, in the case of Julie, he understands that she is someone that he should be faking that he's going along. But we know that he asked for her phone number, but he's not really writing that down.
Just going a little bit deeper with this, Paul isn't listening to anyone, and his first impulse is to walk into a relationship for the first time, meeting somebody, and just tell them about all the bad things that are happening like they should understand, like they should be sympathetic. He's looking for empathy, but he doesn't give any.
I absolutely agree. I think that this is a testament on how decent and how naive this person is. But at the same time, I don't think he ever got to get really deep, empathic moment in his life.
Yeah, but you really sold me on the white privilege argument because it is exactly that kind of pathology, right? Everything is happening to him, and it's happening by virtue of it happening to Paul. It's happening to us, the audience. But he never really tries to escape that particular framework.
He never questions himself.
Yeah.
He's nothing like this should happen to me.
That's
his attitude.
Right, exactly, yeah. One more thing I think is really worth mentioning at this point, there's a great piece that Steven Soderbergh put on his blog back when he used to write his blog before he just simply listed everything he watched each year. But it's going back maybe, 3-4 years. Soderbergh talks about watching the film and just what a great script. We have to talk about what an amazing script it is for, as Soderbergh put it, all of the roadblocks, all of the obstacles. It is kind of like the perfect screenplay in the sense that once we've established the character, everything that can be done, no matter how extraordinary, how silly, anything that you can do to the character to make them suffer, well, Paul really does suffer.
Yeah, it's really straight from lesson in screenwriting.
Screenwriting, yeah, exactly. So we've seen that Paul's date has gone south, that Paul tries to escape that situation, only be pulled back into it. Paul finds that she's died. Paul tries to get the money from Tom, and then only to find that Tom is also grieving his girlfriend's death. I mean, it really is every single thing, and largely coincidental, of course, but every single bad thing that can be done to Paul, Mignon has done to Paul. And also I was reminded, talking about Soderbergh, now I'm going to talk about Fincher, but it reminds me also of that comment that Fincher made, and we always talk about this, the comment that he made in the Truffaut-Hitchcock documentary, the one where Fincher's by far the most interesting person in the documentary, so people can complain, but Fincher's comments in that documentary, I think, are fantastic. He talks about the perversity of the director and how the more perverse you are and the more you show your own perversity as a director, the more you will be able to engage the audience. And I think that that's really interesting. And here, we're really making Paul suffer. And as we'll continue going through the story, Paul's suffering so much. And we, the audience, are loving it. Going back to the roadblocks, it's
exactly.
Like, it's great to see him suffer.
That's the main difference, for comparison, we think about a movie I cited before, The Wrong Man by Hitchcock, and here it's like the stakes are so high because we like the character. We know that the protagonist is a good man, is a nice man. In the case of Paul, I don't know if he's a good man. I don't know if he's a likable character.
But we don't know anything about him.
Yeah.
I mean, we said that all of the other characters are ciphers, but Paul's a cipher. We don't know anything about Paul. Paul lives the life of the narrator in Fight Club. Paul is the guy. If it were 10, 15 years later, he's the guy who is shopping through the IKEA catalog and he's looking for the perfect Helvar fridge which will fit into a particular set.
Something very generic, but he thinks it's unique.
Absolutely, yeah. And again, that's why it reminded me also of Emmett in Lego Movie. These characters are all, they're looking to be complete.
So I think all the series of tragedies, it's like we can watch it. It's more like watching a train wreck. It's like you cannot stop watching. So you don't feel guilty about rejoicing about what happened to him.
As an audience, it's fantastic because it's not really happening to you. All right, well, let's move on to part 3 of the story. Looking down at the street from Kiki's loft, Paul sees a group of people with torches, and they're not flaming torches, they're, flashlights. They appear to be the neighbors from Tom's apartment, searching the area for the burglar. Once they've safely passed by, Paul leaves Kiki's building and spots a cab which he flags down. As it screeches to a halt, a passenger door flies open and strikes Paul in the arm. A woman, Gail, Catherine O'Hara, gets out of the cab and apologizes profusely for hitting him. Paul tells her that he's fine and leans into the cab to speak with the driver. By coincidence, it's the same driver who drove off unpaid at the start of the evening. Paul holds forth the $20 bill and exclaims that now he has the money. The driver grabs the bill from Paul's hand and speeds off without our hapless word processor. Gail motions to Paul's arm that he's bleeding and insists that she do something about his arm. Paul agrees to accompany her to her apartment, if only to make a telephone call. When they arrive, Paul breathes a sigh of relief, saying, "You wouldn't believe what I've been through tonight." From nowhere, Gail explains that she drives a Mr. Softy truck. Paul responds, "No, I didn't ask what you do. I said you wouldn't believe the night I've had." Without missing a beat, Gail says, "No, it's not boring." Ignoring Gail's eccentric behavior, Paul says he wants to make that call. He reaches directory information and asks for the number of a Rydell on Mulberry Street. As he's memorizing the number, Gail starts shouting out other random numbers. Very funny. Now I've forgotten the number, he says. To which Gail replies, "I'm trying to entertain you." Giving up on the telephone, Paul agrees to have Gail look at his arm and takes off his shirt. Gail spots a piece of paper stuck to his skin. Paper mache. As Paul tries to explain that he's been dipping earlier in the evening, Gail reads what appears to be a short newspaper article on his shoulder. It reads in part, "A man was torn limb from limb by an irate mob last night in the fashionable Soho area of Manhattan." Paul jumps up, very much recognizing his own predicament. Paul then tries to leave, but Gail insists driving him home in her Mr. Softy truck. As they're walking to the truck, they both spot a wanted-style poster on a light pole. On the poster is Julie's drawing of Paul, with the title, "This man has been burglarizing the neighborhood." Gail turns to Paul. "You're dead, pal." At that moment, Paul sees torchlights coming toward him. There are raised voices. Gail blows a whistle hanging around her neck, and Paul takes off into the night. In the distance, Paul can hear the Mr. Softy truck starting up. Paul attempts to hide from the mob. He first runs into a building and hits all of the buzzers at once, and there's a great little bit of improvisation here from Griffin Dunne, where he shouts out, "Mom, it's me!" He then climbs the fire escape and watches as the group pass by. While he's up on the fire escape, he looks in a window and sees a man and a woman argue briefly before the woman pulls a revolver from a drawer and shoots the man multiple times.
And here I think is really, really great.
I talk about escalation, right?
Talk about escalation. And here Paul says, "I bet they're going to blame this one on me too."
Exactly. With the coast now being clear, Paul climbs down and pleads to the heavens, and it's that kind of platoon shot. "What do you want from me? What have I done?" And there's a great little bit that Scorsese has in the commentary, right?
When Paul says that he just wanted to have a little bit of fun, but do I deserve to die for it? And Scorsese yelled, "Yes!"
Paul now sees a man, Robert Plunkett, standing rather suspiciously on the street and runs up to him. Paul begs the man to take him home with him. The action shifts to the man's apartment, where Paul immediately asks to use the telephone while the man explains that it's the first time I've been with a man and there are some things I just won't do. Paul's so distracted that he hears none of this. He calls the police and explains that he's being pursued by a vigilante mob, but the police promptly hang up on him. Paul asks to use the bathroom and again stares at himself in the mirror. And there's a kind of recurring theme, him looking at himself in bathroom mirrors.
Almost checking if he's still there, if he's still alive.
Exactly. When Paul returns, the man is still sitting numbly on the sofa. Paul begins to recount the events of that evening. It's a fantastic monologue, and it's probably the ideal audition piece, talking about all of the different events and what motivated him and how the world has been against him all evening. It ends with the man's response to Paul's plight, "You're completely deranged." Glancing outside, Paul sees Julie putting up posters with Paul's sketch on it. He shouts out to her, and she quickly gets on a bicycle and rides away. Paul pushes past the man out onto the street. Then he goes from light pole to light pole, scrunching up the posters. When he hears the sound of the Mr. Softy van, he runs in the opposite direction, back toward the Moondance Diner. He runs into the restaurant and finds Tom the barman sitting in one of the booths. Paul is so out of breath from running that he can barely form sentences. He tells Tom that he's not the burglar. Tom gets up and suggests he's going to take Paul's keys and return them to him. The cashier arrives with Paul's burger and coffee, his order from before. A punk-looking girl enters the diner and gives Paul a flyer for a conceptual art event at Club Berlin, a private party. He crumples the paper as he hears the forbidding sound of the Mr. Softy jingle. Looking outside the window, Paul spies bartender Tom talking to Gail and gesturing to Paul in the diner. Paul charges out of the diner and back onto the street. Running, he opens the invitation in his hand.
Actually, this scene has some precise instruction from Scorsese, as Michael Ballhaus recalls. Scorsese said, "Do you remember that scene in Marnie when she is about to kill the horse and she looks at the pistol?" And obviously, as all of us, Ballhaus said, not really. But for the sake of this podcast, I rewatched Marnie, and I can say the construction is exactly the same. As Paul runs, looking at the invitation in his hand, Marnie looks at the gun that she's holding before shooting the horse. So yes, Marty, you were right.
Arriving at the entrance to the club, Paul thrusts the invitation into the bouncer's hand and he's waved right through. Inside, the club is almost empty, save for a barman and a woman in her 50s, June, played by Verna Bloom, sitting alone at a corner table.
Here we have a totally different barman. How on earth is it possible that from Mohawk Night, packed, we come to an empty space? Also, this scene is very interesting because Griffin Dunne suggested Scorsese does an end slating. So he went across the corner, went to a bar, ordered a drink for everyone, and then when the barman turned to get his check or something, he just ran away without paying.
That's right.
And
yeah.
then he entered the club. So the face we see him in this scene is the face he does when he opens the club door.
Paul asks the barman why the club is so quiet. He replies, "Everyone just stayed home, I guess." Paul asks the barman who the woman in the corner is. "That's June," he replies. "She's always here. Usually nobody notices her." The barman tells Paul that they'll be closing soon. Paul goes to the bathroom a fourth time that evening to regard himself in the mirror. When he returns, he puts a coin in the jukebox and Peggy Lee's "Is That All There Is" begins to play. Paul looks over to June and asks if she would like to join him for a drink. "I'm having a really bad night, and I can't seem to find anyone who would just sit with me without yelling at me. There, I've bared my soul to you." Without speaking, June stands and silently they begin to dance, arm in arm. There is a sudden knock at the door, and the barman moves to the entrance. Still dancing, June begins to speak to Paul, asking why he is being so nice to her. The barman tells them that he's closing the place up for the night.
Here Paul is finally saying the same thing that other women has been telling him, that he just wants to talk, that he wants to have a quiet moment in the night. And also it's a different objective for him. It's like, I want to live, he says. There are some critics that says that in this particular scene, Paul reverts to a childlike status, almost
He does.
looking for a mother figure in the woman.
June asks Paul to come downstairs with her. They walk through the club and she opens the basement door. Paul sits on her bed and leans on her shoulder as June strokes his hair. There's a crash upstairs as the vigilantes break into the bar. Paul, panicking, asks if there's another way out of there. June says no, and nevertheless, Paul runs to the next room in search of an escape route. It's filled with papier-mâché sculptures. A rope hangs down in the center of the room. Attempting to climb it, a large bucket of liquid plaster falls directly on top of him. Again, June tells Paul to come with him. The scene cuts to Gail and the vigilantes upstairs demanding that the barman let them search the place. Back downstairs, June tells Paul to sit still as she wraps him head to toe in plaster. Eventually, Gail and her comrades burst into the downstairs apartment and turn it over. They walk directly past Paul, who's now a living sculpture. The mob eventually leave, and June whispers to Paul that she'll go back upstairs to check if they've really gone. Moments later, Neil and Pepe climb down from a manhole, and Pepe thinks he recognizes the statue. Together, they lift Paul in his plaster cast up and onto the street as dawn approaches. They pack him into the back of their van and speed off. As they drive, the street signs flash past. They're driving uptown. As they wheel around a corner, the back doors of the van fly open, and the sculpture with Paul travels airborne out the back and falls to the street, crash landing right in front of the large metal doors to Paul's office. Paul stands up and, zombie-like, walks into the building. We watch as, still covered in plaster dust, he sits down at his computer. It greets him with the words, "Good morning, Paul." The film finishes as it began, with a dolly shot, but this time moving away from Paul as the other employees arrive to start their day.
Really a circle coming to an end. And it's really a neat, perfect ending that almost feels like the natural thing. But it was really a struggle to find this ending.
Because it wasn't scripted that way, was it?
I think there were a lot of endings that were tested. One of this, which I think is more the most absurd.
I know where you're going. Why didn't you explain it, Maria?
So June suggests that she has a place where Paul can hide, and it's her womb. And then she gives birth to him along the highway.
Yeah, I think the idea was, according to the commentary in the DVD, that June was going to have Paul hide inside her.
Yeah.
And then she was going to basically give birth to him on the turnpike. So it's essentially being John Malkovich.
Yeah.
Maybe it was a little bit too soon.
It was too modern. Other possible endings were, of course, he stays as a sculpture. Or he
stays trapped inside the sculpture, yeah.
Or he dies. But first of all, Martin Scorsese's dad said that Paul cannot die. So he was really adamant about the fact that protagonists should survive.
So the ending, as I understand it, the ending was suggested by
none other than Michael Powell.
Exactly, yeah.
That was about to marry Thelma Schoonmaker shortly after. Mm-hmm. And he suggested it at an earlier stage, but it was discarded as absurd. It's like the film should end.
That's too. Imagine Scorsese is like, yeah. That's too normal. Like this film, you can't do that.
But at the end, it was the most sensible and the most logic ending. I think it's beautiful that Paul's adventure finishes as it starts in front of the office.
In front of the PC with a blinking light saying, "Good morning, Paul."
AI at an earlier stage.
So, Maria, we talked a lot in setting up this show about the kind of mythological interpretation.
Yeah, Martin Scorsese himself says that, for example, in Richard Schickel's conversation with Scorsese, that he's always been interested in the ancient world, so Roman world or Greek world before Christianity. And of course, this story is one of the most popular tropes in ancient literature, which in ancient Greek is called katabasis, which is the descent in the underworld.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Katabasis. And this means that usually heroes or semi-gods were allowed being alive during the lifetime to go in the underworld. And, there's so many elements that really recall that. For example, the fact that you need to cross a river, that a ferryman, Sharon, is guiding. And there's so many elements, like the first diner that Marcy and Paul goes to, it's called The River. Or the taxi driver has a hat that says Captain. So, so there's so many elements. But at the end of the day, Paul is not a semi-god, is not a hero. Maybe he is kind of a wannabe Ulysses, a wannabe Odysseus, because there's one thing that certainly is really reminiscent of mythology, which is the presence of so many women whose common denominator is they want to save Paul. they want to save him so much that
Do they?
entrap him. And
Yeah, I would say more entrapment, but yes.
entrap him and ultimately transform him in something subhuman. Like, for example, in the Odyssey, Circe transformed man in pig. And in this case, we have Paul transformed in a sculpture.
I mean, this film does open itself up to interpretation. I mean, there is one particular interpretation that, and you've heard this before, that Paul is actually dead.
Yeah.
And this has been applied to a lot of films, but I think in this particular case, it does kind of make some sense that something's happened to Paul, and Paul is in this kind of purgatorial world where nothing makes sense, and he doesn't understand what's really happening to him.
He's the only one who doesn't know that, in fact, he's dead.
Right.
I think that what led to this interpretation is Gail, Catherine O'Hara's character, saying, Paul, you're dead.
Yeah, I mean, this is a popular theory, and of course it's been applied to other films. Here, the idea that After Hours is really the afterlife, that it's purgatory. This is covered in an article online on Film School Rejects, so we'll link to that in the show notes.
But in the theme of interpretations, I think the most compelling interpretation that was given was by Roger Ebert, that had a really interesting point about the structure of the film. Quoting, he says, in After Hours, each new person Paul meets promises that they will take care of him, make him happy, lend him money, give him a place to stay, let him use the telephone, trust him with their keys, drive him home. And every offer of mercy turns into unanticipated danger. The film could be read as an emotional autobiography of that period in Scorsese's life.
Yeah, so this is a great time to mention that this was a successful film for Scorsese, that after the failures of New York, and losing money on King of Comedy, that Scorsese was able to kind of get back into what he loves doing, which is making kind of fast-paced personal pictures. I think it's really important to keep in mind that this is an important film, even though it doesn't necessarily get as much attention as the films immediately before or after it. So, for example, The Color of Money, it made money, not the greatest film. Then Last Temptation of Christ, very obviously a personal film that also caused a lot of problems for Scorsese in terms of critical reception. He's following films like Raging Bull and Taxi Driver, and he's struggling to get the money to make his epic about Jesus Christ. He gets this happening, and he's sort of back in the game. Right?
And Marcus, we've been talking about that in the last episode about Orson Welles. The reputation that a director can have of being unable to finish a film or to be difficult to work with can really doom your career. So at that point, Martin Scorsese was really struggling.
Yeah.
And the thing that comes off in the DVD is that he constantly said, both to Amy Robinson but also to Ballhaus, how this film made him regain the joy of making
That's
films.
right, the joy, the passion,
the passion.
For making movies. Exactly.
And let's not forget that this won Best Direction in Cannes.
That's right. It won the Best Director award at Cannes for Scorsese. I think it's his first. But Maria, this film wasn't without controversy, was it?
Yeah, and it involved the script. So later on, it surfaced that Minion had plagiarized portions of the story of After Hours from a 1982 radio artist Joe Frank's NPR Playhouse monologue entitled Lies.
Yeah, so it's got exactly the same title. This is also a script that was written pre-internet, and I think we'd probably hear a lot more about it if that were today. In fact, it probably couldn't even happen today.
Yeah.
But it is interesting, isn't it, that Mignon didn't go on to make any other big features. I think the only thing that really stands out on his resume is Vampire's Kiss with Nick Cage.
The thing about this plagiarism is that it's not just coincidence. There's the bagels and cream cheese paperweights and Marcy's story about being raped and about having a husband that lives abroad whom she exchanges letters every day. There's too many coincidences.
Yeah. That said, the scandal didn't really affect the film's critical reputation. I mean, today, it's sort of seen as a cult classic, isn't it?
Yeah, I think in the video or DVD era, it became more and more a hidden classic, a hidden gem.
So if you haven't seen the film, and why were you listening to the entire plot with spoilers without seeing the film? Go and watch it. It is an amazing film. After Hours, directed by Martin Scorsese from 1985. You've been listening to The Last Picture House. Be sure to let us know what you think of the show on Twitter, where we're at Last Pick House. Follow us on Facebook or on Instagram, where we're Last Picture House, one word. And we'll be back in 2 weeks to celebrate the anniversary of Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs. Thanks for listening.